here in the second part of our final unit on food safety and technology, we're going to focus on genetic engineering of food and making a very specific and extended discussion on one very specific food item that has been genetically engineered and used extensively in our food supply. But when we talk about genetic engineering, what we're really referring to here is the use of science, genetic science, to modify an existing crop. And so this slide illustrates the steps, the general steps involved in producing a genetically modified organism, and in this case the genetically modified organism that we'll discuss in greater detail in this unit, or in this part of Unit 8, is corn. So to do this, the DNA of the host cell, being corn, will include an inserted gene from another desired organism. So that gene is extracted from a cell. It's combined with the existing DNA of the host cell, and the host cell in this case is corn. And that DNA has to be what's called cultured inside the lab. So culturing the new DNA molecule is a process in the lab where multiple billions of copies are made. And once those copies are made, then those copies can then be extracted and inserted into the DNA of an existing cell. In this case, what we want to modify, and that's corn. And corn would typically not have this gene, but once that gene is inserted and grown, the corn will then begin to express the proteins that are coded by this newly included gene that would not normally be there. So that produces a different type of corn, often referred to as Bt corn, and we'll take a very specific look at that on the next slide. So when we talk about corn, corn is a member of the grass family, or referred to as maize. The United States and China are the largest corn growers in the world. It's Canada's third largest crop, and most corn in Canada are actually crossbred and are hybrids. So some of this genetically modified corn in Canada is referred to as Bt corn, named after the organism from which the gene was obtained. So the bacterium DNA has what's called insecticidal properties, and so one of the concerns with growing corn is damage induced by various pests. And so Bt delta endotoxin is a protein. So the gene from this bacterium is harvested and is incorporated into this new strain of corn referred to as Bt corn, and this included gene will produce a protein that will break down the intestinal tissue of the pests that would normally destroy an entire crop of this corn. So the protein breaks down the gut wall, and that bacteria will then invade and other infections will then destroy the pests that would normally that could destroy an entire crop. So when we take a look at corn usage, and we'll take a look at the graph here in a moment, corn is used for a wide range of purposes. It's primarily used as livestock feed. It's has been used for some time as a biofuel, in that the components of corn are used and transformed into something called ethanol. And ethanol is a type of alcohol, in this case, that can be used to fuel certain types of motor vehicles with engines that can handle that biofuel. Corn is also used to produce certain starches, is used for corn oil and HFCS, which is high fructose corn syrup, and will be the focus of our discussion for the rest of this part of Unit 8. Corn is used into and incorporated into certain plastics. So the starch that is obtained from corn is chemically transformed into other products that will eventually be formed and composed of certain plastics and used in a wide range of various products. And the final and last and least usage of corn is actually for human consumption. So as humans, we don't consume nearly as much corn as what is grown. Most of the corn that is grown in North America and overseas are used for a wide range of other purposes. And if we take a look at the graph below, we see that, at least in Canada, we see a continual increase in corn production per year between 1960 and 2013. So our reliance on corn for all of these different purposes have continued to increase over time. Now, when we talk about corn and sugar consumption in the U.S., comparable data do not exist for Canada, so we're going to use U.S. data here. We see that from 1970 through 2010, we see in the U.S. the consumption, the per capita, per person consumption of refined sugars have decreased considerably and has started to flatten out over 2010. However, total sugar consumption, so refined sugar is just one type of sugar, but in terms of the total sugar consumption, we see from 1970, we see a fast increase and a slower increase and an eventual slow decay as the understanding of the effects of high sugar consumption on human health have become realized. But nevertheless, over the time where refined sugar decreases, total sugar consumption increases. And paralleling that total sugar consumption increase is the increase in the per capita consumption of a product that appeared in the early 1970s in the United States, referred to as high fructose corn syrup. So high fructose corn syrup, as the name indicates, it's made from corn, it's in liquid form, and it has a relatively high level of fructose, which is a monosaccharide. And it's used as an alternative sweetener to sucrose. So in the 1950s and 60s, the chemical process to make high fructose corn syrup was discovered. In the 1970s, following that discovery, following years of work and discovery, the 1970s saw an industrial scale level increase and development of this process to make high fructose corn syrup. And this process was developed to the point where high fructose corn syrup began to be introduced and incorporated in the food industry. And this addressed some problems with sucrose. So when you think about sucrose, sucrose is a disaccharide that exists in a natural form. And the problem with sucrose is that sucrose is an unstable molecule in acidic solutions. So with certain food preparations, adding sucrose doesn't play much of an advantage, particularly if shelf life is of concern. To use sucrose, it must be dissolved in water, and the origin of the stimulus to produce an alternative to sucrose is that in North America and Canada and the United States, both countries were dependent on importing sucrose from countries that could grow cane sugar and sugar beets to a very large extent and provide and meet the demand for sucrose in North America. And this was realized in World War II. And so in Canada and the United States, there was a very drastic shortage of sucrose and hence sugar in both countries, as the sugar that existed was shipped overseas to support the war effort. And so this posed a very big problem to North America in obtaining enough sucrose to feed the demand. And so the discovery of high fructose corn syrup posed some advantages. The first advantage is that it came from a renewable crop that had a high yield, i.e. corn, that could easily be grown in Canada and the United States. It didn't require the continual warm weather that equatorial countries need and use to make cane sugar. High fructose corn syrup is much more easily stored and transported. It's a much more stable product than sucrose. The cost of manufacturing high fructose corn syrup since the industrialization of the process has decreased considerably, making it an effective and attractive financial product to use. And it also retains the same properties as sucrose. So sucrose is a disaccharide. High fructose corn syrup is also a disaccharide. And the body interprets our ingestion of high fructose corn syrup in the same way it does sucrose in terms of the physiological effects that it has. If we take a look at the food source of high fructose corn syrup and how it's made, we'll first look at this drawing of a corn kernel. So we see a corn kernel is made up of a number of different components. We have the outer hull and the fiber, the germ layer, the level of starch, and there is some gluten in corn. And that gluten is interwoven with the starch molecules in part of the endosperm, but we also see a considerable component of the corn kernel made up of just starch, carbohydrate-only molecules. So in order to get access to this starch, corn kernels are milled, which is a term which refers to the fact that corn kernels are crushed by being moved through steel rollers, so they're ground up. By grinding up, the parts of the corn kernel are separated from each other. The starch and only the starch level is obtained, and that starch is converted to a liquid form, which now becomes corn syrup. It's important to note here that corn syrup is made up of 100% glucose. The component of sucrose or sugar that people find desirable is not the glucose component but the fructose component. So the glucose molecules, the corn syrup and the starch, amylases are added, and so amylases are enzymes that are designed to break up the chemical bonds holding glucose molecules together. So the starch, which is made up of polysaccharides, are broken up so that individual glucose molecules, monomers, exist and are not bound to each other, allowing for the conversion of some of those glucose molecules to fructose. And how that's done is that another enzyme referred to as an isomerase, so ASC, it's a protein that functions as an enzyme that speeds up a chemical reaction. This chemical reaction will take a glucose molecule that's been separated from other glucose molecules and is converted to a different monosaccharide. And that monosaccharide is fructose, and it's the fructose that provides that sweet taste to sugars. So the isomerase, as mentioned, it's an enzyme that creates an isomer, which is a different form of glucose. It retains the same number of atoms. It's a C6H12O6 molecule, but it's rearranged and assembled in a different form, and that different form is fructose. This is a process that naturally occurs inside our muscle cells, our red blood cells, and our neurons, for example, in how we break up glucose and use glucose as a fuel source. Now, in terms of high fructose corn syrup composition, this table summarizes different forms of sugar and the monosaccharide composition of those food sources. So if we start with naturally occurring sucrose. So this is sucrose that was manufactured by nature. This is what's found in various fruits. This is what's found in cane sugar or sugar cane, as well as sugar beets. And we see an equal distribution of fructose monosaccharides and glucose monosaccharides in sucrose. If we examine pure corn syrup, and this is corn syrup that has not been processed yet, the starch has been removed from the corn kernel and been liquefied, we see it's composed of 100% of only glucose monomers. The two most common high fructose corn syrup products are referred to as HFCS 42 and HFCS 55, named accordingly to the proportion of the monosaccharides that exist in those individual products in the form of fructose. So HFCS 42 is the final processed form of corn syrup, where 42% of the sucrose molecules, of the glucose molecules here in corn syrup have been transformed to fructose monomers. Likewise, HFCS 55 refers to the fact that 55% of the glucose monomers in corn syrup have been converted to fructose, giving it a fairly equivalent, a very similar composition to that found in naturally occurring sugars. So one of the concerns with high fructose corn syrup is related to its relationship to obesity rates, with the idea that because high fructose corn syrup consumption increased, that must be tied to the increasing obesity rates that occurred after the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. So we'll take a look at some data here, and these are selected countries in 2005, and try to examine patterns that would either confirm or possibly question that relationship between high fructose corn syrup and the prevalence of obesity. So in terms of high fructose corn syrup usage, high fructose corn syrup accounted for 50% of all the sweeteners used in 2005 in the United States, in part because high fructose corn syrup was a low-cost alternative that could be manufactured and sourced entirely in the United States. Worldwide, high fructose corn syrup only made up 8% of all sweeteners. And so the reason for this is in part due to domestic product protection. Because the United States developed the industrial scale technology to produce high fructose corn syrup at a low cost, the desire to export that technology is not going to be very strong. And so part of the reason is that the U.S. has that technology to develop their own sweetener. And the industrial scale technology is actually quite limited. So some countries which have a high sugar demand by their population may not be able to support and pay for the technology to start the process in producing high fructose corn syrup. But in terms of high fructose corn syrup as a potential cause of obesity, we have to take a look at some of these ratios in comparing different countries. And so we'll take a look at a summary here on the right-hand side of the slide, and eventually we'll move over to the left-hand side. So the ratio between high fructose corn syrup and obesity, the ratios are somewhat similar between Canada and the United States. But when we take a look at the ratios between Canada and Japan, the ratio of HFCS consumption per capita and obesity rates, we actually see an opposite trend occurring between these two countries. And when we examine Argentina and Mexico, we see that these two countries have a fairly low per capita intake of high fructose corn syrup, but also have very high obesity rates. So when we examine the graph here on the left-hand side, Here we see the percent of the population that fits the obese category. We see that in the United States, in the very dark gray shaded bar, we see that high fructose corn syrup approaching that 50%. Here in Canada, it's approaching 25%, so it's quite a bit lower in Canada. But we also see that the obesity rates are also lower in Canada. So by focusing on these two countries, we might conclude that high fructose corn syrup ingestion consumption is directly tied to obesity rates. However, if we contrast Canada and Japan, we see that high fructose corn syrup consumption is slightly higher here in the dark gray bar, is slightly higher than that in Canada, yet the obesity rates are considerably much lower in Japan than it is in Canada. And if we examine two other countries, Argentina and Mexico, we see that high fructose corn syrup consumption in Argentina is lower than that in Canada, much lower in Mexico than it is in Canada. But the obesity rates in Argentina and Mexico are reported to be, for the most part, quite a bit greater than it is in Canada. So this study here would throw some questioning as to the direct link between high fructose corn syrup and obesity rates, concluding that understanding obesity rates is a very complex issue that incorporates many more factors than just high fructose corn syrup. So this ends the second part of our 8th unit on food safety and technology.